Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm really excited to share all the great mosquito information that our featured speaker has planned for us. I'd like to just welcome everybody to the October Globe Mission Mosquito webinar. And since it's a webinar, please use the chat, and you're welcome to send a message to the panelists, and we'll answer your questions in real time as quickly as we possibly can. We're beginning our 5th year, and we're on to our 57th webinar since we've started. So we're super thrilled to share more mosquito information with you. We have a couple mosquito data updates. Our featured presenter is Dr. Catherine Bruna, and then just a quick review of the Mission Mosquito Larva Hunters Facilitators Guide and Guide, just some links that you can use to check out those resources. Since we're beginning our 5th year, we are now cumulatively at 37,509 observations worldwide. And the map kind of shows you where our observation locations are. And I can't tell you how excited we are because we built the database from the ground up. And so without you, we wouldn't have 37,509 observations at all. So thank you again very much, and continue to report where you're finding those habitats.
Great. Hi. Traffic was bad, but I got here just in time. So welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Catherine Bruna. I know her as Katie. Katie is a professor of social cultural studies of education. She and I actually have a common background. We both had studied anthropology in our graduate work. So immediately when I met her thoughts and her approaches to her work really resonated with me. She's at the College of Human Sciences at Iowa State University. She has been involved in a lot of important work that is supporting equity and education. She is an affiliate faculty for Latinx studies at the university. And most importantly for this talk today, she is the principal investigator, co-principal investigator of the Urban Ecosystem Project, which is also called Mosquitoes and Me. And the work that she has been doing has been very important towards raising awareness about mosquitoes and about their role in society and what we can do to make the world a better place. And I just had to put this quote that she has on her signature line, that educational anthropology connects learning to living. I truly believe that. And so I think we have a lot to learn today from Dr. Katie. Mm-hmm. So Katie, welcome to our webinar series. It's really great to see your face. Yeah. You look exactly like you look on the Carousel of Happiness. So Katie came to visit me this spring, and I took this picture on the Carousel of Happiness, which is in Nederland, Colorado. And so we had a good time. So without further ado, Katie, we'd like to hear about what you are doing.
Yeah, what a way to start. The Carousel of Happiness. Immediately, it's activating my schemata and making me feel really even more happy to be here. So mosquito scientists unite. That's how we start when we work with youth in our Mosquitoes and Me summer camp. And I know you are all mosquito scientists united in your work to get everybody feeling like they can be a mosquito scientist too. And that impulse, right, is at the heart of the work that we've been doing with kids. So Cassie, if you'll go to the next slide. I'm going to talk to you about the Urban Ecosystem Project, as Rusty said, and particularly the Mosquitoes and Me summer camps that we ran. So if you want to go to the next slide there. So, I'm not the only one in this work. I have as you heard, I'm an educational anthropologist by training. So I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be doing work related to mosquitoes. So I need to tell you a story, right, about how I got into that. So Dr. Lyric Bartholomew at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the School of Veterinary Medicine is a mosquito scientist, and she's also a dear friend of mine. And in a role that when she was at Iowa State, this is about 10 years ago now, I was coming into leadership of a college access program that I'll tell you about because it is relevant to the work that we do. It's called the ISU for You Promise. It strategically targets two of the most racially, ethnically diverse and socioeconomically stressed schools in Des Moines, and provides students at those two schools with the possibility of receiving tuition awards when they arrive as undergraduates at Iowa State. So it's a promise program, and it's meaning to create these relationships between the university and these two schools. And as I was stepping into the leadership role, I knew that a question I was going to get asked was, it's one thing to promise students tuition awards when they come to Iowa State, and it's another thing to get them ready, right? For the kind of work that they need to do to finish high school, right? Get admitted and succeed, right? And graduate and move on to lives, right? After their undergraduate. And so Lyric, being a good friend of mine, we were out having a beer, and we were talking about how we might put her mosquitoes to use in service of some academic programming, some science programming. I am a cultural studies of science education scholar. I won't talk too much more about that today, but if you're interested, you can sort of Google me. So science itself is not far afield. I'm not trained as a scientist, but as someone who uses science to explore issues of identity and power and access. So we got together and we're thinking about how we could use the work that Lyric was doing, right, and involve young people and their families who we typically wouldn't think of as entomologists, given the demographics of the entomology field. And right after that conversation, an NIH SEPA announcement came out, and we just thought, this is perfect. We met again and over a beer sketched out a grant, and we got funded on our very first shot. So it just shows you the importance of really inspired brainstorming. So next slide. So Lyric's in this work. She's not here today, but she's very much a part of the work that I do. So what I'd like to talk to you all about is give you, and I have already, right? I've talked to you a little bit about the Education Mosquito Science Collaboration. I want to get into the aims and background of the Urban Ecosystem Project. Particularly, I want to share with you the work of the Mosquitoes in Me Summer Camp. And I want to do this in a way that might be a bit unusual. We're not going to start with the science. We're going to start with the community building. As I mentioned, my role in initiating my role of this project was really thinking about using it to create relationships between Iowa State and these two schools. And so community building, not just at the camp, but sort of even more broadly, right? At building sort of a notion of a synergized effort between the university and the schools and the communities to create college-going climates and cultures. That was key to the work. So I'm going to start with the community building. I will talk about the Mosquitoes in Me curriculum and about a particular pedagogical foundation that I and Lyric together sort of envisioned to ground the work in terms of some diversity pedagogy goals. I do want to talk about my Mosquito Sucks science comic, and I'll tell you right now that I have these available for all of you to use in your science programming. So shoot me an email after this session. Tell me what you want, how many of them you need, where you are, and we'll figure it out. Those, I have complimentary copies available. And then I want to be sure that you know that in support of the Mosquitoes in Me curriculum, we have a Mosquitoes in Me science journal, as well as other instructional supports, and also a Teaching and Learning with Insects, the Educator's Guide. So we'll go to the next slide. So the aims of the collaboration, right, as I mentioned, utilizing mosquito science to engage, right, youth, their interest, enhance their positive identification with science, and motivate continued study. And also to prepare educators to use a particular sort of science pedagogy, authentic and ambitious science teaching in culturally responsive ways, given the audience that we were working with, and you'll see some demographics of that in a bit. And then do the mosquito science, right, public health work of informing the public about mosquito, right, disease prevention methods. if you want to go to the next slide. So I don't want to linger, I think, too much on these slides. This is information that you all know, but these, right, this is sort of the principled stance of the work that we've done in terms of the underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in entomology, right? And also, right, the need to really promote science success amongst all populations, right, but particularly underrepresented populations. And the insects are a way to do that. Right? There is some literature attesting to the power of insects. You'll go to the next slide. Right, and again, you all are well aware of this, the need for urban public health entomology, the particular characteristics of urban spaces, right? And this is really fine-tuning it to the place-based nature of the work that we were doing. So, right, some people might think, in the middle of a big city like Des Moines, right, why do we have to worry so much about mosquitoes? And here's the reasons, right, that we talk about that, particularly this idea that there's sort of, right, a gap between who currently, right, is doing the entomological outreach work in terms of the field of entomology and the particular audiences that, right, maybe in urban spaces that are not well reached by traditional outreach methods. And there might be some distrust around science. There might be some certain, distrust around people poking around in yards and neighborhoods where the perception may be that they don't belong. So the idea of trying to promote entomology and a future in entomology among youth that may never have considered it and may never have been exposed to it, which is likely the case, right, in schools. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so let's get to the summer camp. So this grant has now terminated, but we had, actually 6 years of funding. And 4 years of those, we, from the very beginning, had to design and develop and deliver a summer camp. So we were serving each year approximately 30 upper elementary and middle grades youth, primarily from African American and Latinx background. As I mentioned, these were schools. So these were youth associated with the ISU For You Promise program. So, we wanted to provide science outreach, and we also had this broader goal of building relationships and affiliations with Iowa State. So those two roles were being served in parallel. There were pre-service teachers who had taken a year-long course that we developed called Teaching and Learning with Insects, who had also chosen to do their practicum experiences at those two schools, who then, through the course, learned not about mosquitoes, but they learned about a particular pedagogical approach. And the fact that in this course, they weren't really learning about mosquitoes is important to the co-learning that was part of the camp. So this meant this last bullet here, right? Over this 2-week period of the camp, and actually 1 year, the camp was so popular that students wanted 3 weeks, and we delivered 3 weeks, and then we were too exhausted and we never did it again. It was super fun, but we realized that was pushing us too much. That youth and adult were co-learners, right? So the pre-service teachers who were working as table leaders actually didn't know that much more about mosquitoes than the youth that they were working with. And that was really important to sort of the dynamics of the summer camp. Go to the next slide. So here's some demographics. So just, you can take a look here and, you might reflect on to what extent, right, you yourself has been doing outreach to right, this demographic of students. If you've seen programs that are successful, right, be thinking about what has made those programs successful and what you might hear in what I'm going to share that feels familiar. But this was the targeted audience for our work, and it becomes important because, right, if we think about the kinds of stereotypes that folks who occupy dominant social locations bring in thinking about serving, primarily African-American, right, and Latinx students, right, who live in socioeconomically stressed context, we typically because of our own socialization, may have lowered expectations about what's possible in terms of science programming. And we found in our summer camp, it completely overturned whatever kinds of, preconceptions, right? Even us, right, who are very in tune with our own, right, socialization processes. It overturned our even what we could imagine that these students could do. They were dissecting mosquitoes under microscopes by the end of the camp in ways that Lyric, right, who does this all the time and is an expert, was found very impressive. So, right, we're the ones who need to raise, right, our standards in terms of the kind of educational expectations for the students that we serve. Move to the next slide. This is a picture I put in there just to give you a sense of this co-learning. So if you imagine this environment where we've got the pre-service teachers from Iowa State who predominantly are white women, white middle-class women from rural Iowa communities, right, who've chosen to be teachers, right? That's generally the demographic of elementary education majors. They're working as table leaders with about 5 students. But again, they're not there to teach mosquito content. They're there to deliver and facilitate activity and conversations in very particular ways. And in this way, they're learning sort of alongside youth who are beginning to adapt those discursive practices. And that co-learning, that genuine co-learning, is a really important part of what we do. And this sort of gets the idea of the parallel activity of these audiences. And you see, of course, the ISU For You Promise t-shirt in the background, one of the pre-service teachers is wearing. You'll go to the next slide, please. So I said I was going to start with community building, and so I am. A really important part, as I said, was us beginning to build positive relationships with youth that were on this track, that we wanted to keep on this track coming to ISU. So every morning the students would enter and we would handshake, right, and take the time to engage each learner as they entered the classroom with a welcome. We shared food. We had breakfast and lunch and snacks. We had mailboxes. You can see these in the image on the right, where there were times of the day, particularly during meals, where students could write notes to each other, and students could write notes to the educators, and the educators could write notes to the students. And so there was this kind of underground conversation happening all the time. Communication was really important to what we did, and the mailboxes were just a way of sort of keeping that going when we weren't doing other kinds of communication activities. We had a morning circle activity every morning. You'll see a part of that in a video I'm going to show in a minute. Essentially, we did sort of a affirmational chant. We invited recognitions where people could shout out something positive that had happened to them and give somebody kudos for something that they've done. After our first year, or in our first year, youth started stepping into the circle and wanting to share talents. That became something that we built in, where we invited students to share their talents. We had outdoor activities during lunch hour as weather would permit in Iowa. And you can imagine that could go anywhere from really hot, humid temperatures, right, to thunderstorms. So this required a lot of creativity, but and oftentimes students had ideas about what would be good. At the end of the day, there was a closing ritual where we used these, we called them bonding beads, but at each table there was a jar. Students were given beads that were actually themed by the day. You'll see a picture of one of those in a minute. And we had a ritual where we asked them to share either something they learned, something that they felt, or something that they wondered about. And then they would put their bead in the jar. And over the course of 2 weeks, a table jar would fill up with beads. And at the end of the camp, they strung those beads into necklaces, bracelets, keychains. These are the kinds of community building things that we did in this camp that my actual scholarly interest, as it's emerging, is really beginning to think about the power of these in relationship to science, not as separate, but actually fundamentally essential to the sciencing. So if you'll move to the next slide. I think you're going to see some pictures of these in a minute. So, right, just some pictures to give you a sense of what we would do during our outside time. Go to the next slide, please. Right, here's an example of the bonding beads. So these are like FEMA beads that you can get like on Etsy, but the Etsy maker actually worked with us to create some mosquito ones, but you're getting a sense of the role that played. I want to point out in this picture, you see the sticky notes on the wall. We called that our Wonderwall. At any time, students could get up with a question that they had about mosquitoes and put it on the Wonderwall. And we would have a Stump the Entomologist feature at the end of camp where they could ask Lyric a question from the Wonderwall and try to stump her. And sometimes they actually did, which they loved. And so then the sticky notes were a way of also keeping the discursive communication around teaching and learning happening all the time. Okay, next slide, please. These are images from the morning circle. You'll see, like, starting upper left, that's a set of brothers, actually. Their talent was telling jokes. If you move to the bottom left, that's a student sharing some dance moves that he's learned. The upper right is a student singing a song from a Disney movie that she loved. And it was so well received the first time that she shared it again the second time. And the next slide at the bottom is an image of us doing Popsico, and you're going to get a video of this in a minute. So this is how we started the day, which really, it was very meta in the sense that we would talk about ourselves as learners and growing big brains together. But it also did this really important thing of beginning to align our movement. As you'll see here in this particular Popsico is this, I could spend more time than I probably have in explaining it. You'll get a sense, but it requires some imitation. And out of this work, I've actually begun to study the role of, physical alignment, the role of aligned physical activity in actually creating feelings of shared solidarity among people who otherwise might feel different. There's very interesting work out there. And I'm beginning to really turn my attention to thinking about how the kinds of physical alignment that we created during community building rituals, how those transfer actually into the science, the teamed science space in really interesting ways, and made connections happen really fruitfully in terms of the science learning. So Cassie, if you'll go ahead and play this video, please.
Does anybody want to get the pop? I want it. It's for me. Hey, what? I'm so ready. Ready for what? I so don't want to pop. Okay, popsicle. This is how she popsicle. Popsicle. Hey, Lyric. Hey, what? Do you want to pop? Okay, let's pop. Awesome. I'm totally feeling the energy. I hope you're feeling the energy. And we're going to keep that energy growing, but we're going to go into the science classroom.
Friends, we're going to start our morning like we do every morning with a little data collection, okay? So you guys can go into the classroom with your adult educator. Go to those notebook pages 17 and 24 and record your data. That's how we have to start this morning. Okay? All right. I just do my
And then we'd say that our hands are high, our feet are low, and this is how we popsico. And you mimic the motions that somebody's like offering to the group. And so it makes us watch each other actually very carefully and makes us in unison. We become sort of joined through that physical movement. What I was hoping that you would hear is that there's this very, subtle transition from when we're closing down the pop, then Lyric here is saying, okay, everybody, now we're going to go in and we're going to collect data, right? And so there's this just seamless move from the community building into the getting ready to do the sciencing. And then as students are leaving and going into the classroom, which actually this is the high school where most of these students will attend in a few years. So that's part of them, right, getting socialized into their sort of academic, right, trajectory on their way to ISU. Then they continue singing the Popsicle song. So you get the sense of how the community building and the science are seamless, right? So we can move on to the next one, Cassie.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to check, was there anyone who did hear the video?
I did not.
Yeah.
Rusty, you didn't?
I did not, no.
I think it must have gotten lost in the when I uploaded it right into Gmail, Cassie. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just let it go. I think people get a gist. I mean, it is really fun to watch, but let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time again on the curriculum without sort of showing you its pieces, but of course there is sort of principled practice underlying it, right? So we really were aiming for authentic experiential joint activity, right? As you heard, if you'll go to the next slide, right? We were also really trying to engage students emotionally, right? In the content and in their learning experience, right? Again, that's part of the community building. And very fundamentally, the curriculum was intended to integrate ambitious science teaching, which is a model I'm going to talk a little bit about in case folks haven't heard about it. And then ultimately, I came to integrate also diversity theory pedagogy. The integration of ambitious science teaching into the curriculum was there from the beginning. It was part of our proposal to NIH, is that we would create a AST integrated curriculum. You'll go to the next slide. So you can get a sense, this is the overview of the camp. And what I want to do here is just showcase how questions drove the way that we talked about the teaching and learning. So again, the idea of discursive tools and of really big questions that not everybody or anybody has to know all the answers to, but the idea that we're together in pursuit of some compelling questions is a fundamental part of the way we oriented folks to this camp. So you can see those here. You're going to see week 2 here. Cassie, if you'll go to week 2, right? So just wanted you to get a sense of how students were understanding what they were doing when they were coming to camp and their families. Okay, next slide. So I'll get into ambitious science teaching. It's a particular model coming out of the science ed and science ed research. If you just focus right now on the colorful pie pieces in the center circle, that's directly from the Ambitious Science Teaching website. And so if you start, you'll see, right, the numbers of the phases, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to talk about those just briefly. Ambitious Science Teaching is not my, right, that's not my framework. We're borrowing this framework. Really tremendous work has been done. There's an Ambitious Science Teaching whole text, right, that you can read to learn more about it. But the idea is that to counter traditional forms of science instruction that are very didactic, right, and very transmission and reception oriented into something that's much more dialogic and much more oriented towards wonder and curiosity, and because of that, questions. So you start with planning for engagement with a really big science idea driven by this idea of puzzlement, some sort of phenomenon that will be puzzling to folks, and invite them into the inquiry because they're curious about it. The second phase is that you elicit student ideas, right? So make sure that you understand what kinds of, the research would call this sort of naive conceptions are in the room. But of course, we just want to know also what are the funds of knowledge that exist in the room? What are students thinking before they get into learning any further? And then the third phase is really the heart of the instruction that can happen, right? It's ongoing. And that's where you're doing the activities where you're moving students' thinking sort of from one level right to the next through hands-on activity, where if you go to phase 4, you're always pressing for them to provide you evidence-based explanations for their thinking. And for this idea of evidence-based explanations is important because I've been talking about communication in the discursive environment, and you have to be documenting what students are thinking all along the way. So the idea of an audit trail of students' ideas, big pieces of butcher paper where you have student thinking posted around the room. So as you're talking with them and moving their thinking forward, questioning them further, you can be referring back to some thinking that they've done earlier. And this is really affirming for students because they see that their thinking, right, is developing. So again, this discursive environment is really, really important. So that's ambitious science teaching. What happened after our first year of implementation, I'm trained as an educational anthropologist. What that means in terms of my teaching is that I can teach the undergraduate multicultural / social justice education courses, right? That's part of my scholarly background. So after a year of implementation, I began to really understand that if you do ambitious science teaching in a robust way, you're already being facilitated in achieving some of the goals of diversity pedagogy. And diversity pedagogy is its own framework from a scholar, Rosa Hernandez-Sheets. She has a book out called Diversity Pedagogy. That second thin layer there, where I've got it labeled culture, where we've got diversity, identity, social interaction, safe context, inclusive content, language instruction, and assessment, I began to see that each of the ambitious science teaching phases, as we were using them, right, in implementation, actually helped forward. So, as you're eliciting student ideas, for example, that's the place where you can be ensuring that students are having positive social interactions. You can be, affirming their belonging in the space by virtue of, right, honoring their ideas, which is creating a safe context and creating inclusive content. So in that second layer, right, is where I began to then layer diversity pedagogy on top of ambitious science teaching. And then I also have a master's degree in linguistics, so I'm interested in language. And I began to think about the kinds of particular linguistic resources, discursive resources that are part of all of these kinds of actions. And that's the kind of big work that's ahead of me now, but you'll get a sense of what that looks like. So we call this tri-sci, right? It's tri-science, but it's also tri-science because, right, you're invited in a positive way through, right, cognitive, cultural, and communicative strategies. So the next slide. So when I'm talking about like the discursive strategies, this would take a lot more time to explain, right? But cognition and language don't operate separately. So, right, every sort of cognitive effort requires some sort of linguistic resource, right, to achieve. And there are particular kinds of genres, right, that we represent through speech or through our writing, right, for which linguists have identified particular kinds of discursive resources that are part of construing that genre. So this is my way of beginning to map these discursive genres against the ambitious science teaching. So stage one is the planning stage, which is where you're thinking about enabling students right into. So that's in the middle, right? Then we've got phase two of eliciting students' ideas is the triangle on the right. We've got stage three of the scaffolding, right, for ongoing learning and thinking, right? That's the triangle on the left. And at the top is the pressing for evidence-based recommendations. So just kind of a really broad overview. Next slide. And the idea here is that, so this way of thinking is called thinking about socio-semiotic processes of activity. And this is my way in the curriculum of trying to, right, talk to folks about how all of these things are working together. So essentially, right, socio-semiotic processes are meaning-doing processes, and they're construed through particular kinds of discursive devices. Those are like classroom dialogue types. right, that can be associated with a particular phase of science teaching and learning, right? That's the cognition part. And then there are particular pedagogical behaviors that educators, right, can undertake that advance sort of the connection between culture and cognitive outcomes for learners. And so then, right, this is my way of beginning to explain to you all in the curriculum what that tri-sci pedagogical framework is. You can go to the next slide. So this is what I mentioned early on that we have a teaching and learning with insects guide. This is part of that guide where you can see here at the bottom, for example, in stage 1 of ambitious planning, right? There are particular sociosemiotic processes at play, and then there's particular kinds of discourses that were, right, encouraging educators using the Mosquitoes and Me curriculum, right, to adopt these kinds of discursive practices. Go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're getting into sort of the work of the summer camp. So planning around a big idea, right, a big phenomenon. And for us, we sort of cheated a little bit in the sense that it's not a like actual science phenomenon, but it is a really big puzzling question. So we asked in a battle, right, for the end of the world, who would win, mosquitoes or humans? And this is an example of the kind of recording we would do of student thinking. And out of this, then we said, okay, so what would you need to learn more to be really certain about who would win, humans or mosquitoes? They would talk about that. We would generate those ideas. How would you go about learning those things, right? We'd think about that, talk about that. And out of that, then it was easy for us to, our first year, develop the curriculum with its biology, ecology, and like disease transmission components. And then, right, in subsequent years, sort of organize and continue to develop. But the whole curriculum is driven by this question. So as we're implementing, we're returning to how is this helping us answer this question? Okay, go to the next slide. I am keeping my eye on the clock. So this gives you a sense of Unit 1, right, what the Unit 1 lessons look like. You see the tri-sci stage on the left. It's about 175 in whole. It's about 175 page curriculum. It's got these 3 units with about 4 lessons, I think, each. We actually have a 4th unit on mosquito human interaction that is not as well developed, but still substantive. And the focus questions and a brief description. Go to the next slide. Right, just another example, Unit 2, go to the next slide. I know these are going really quickly. Unit 3, again, but the idea of question driven, right? And here's a way of thinking about how, and these we aligned them with next generation science standards. And this image is just a way of saying, so for example, in an activity from the larval nutrition lesson, in terms of cultural connections, we do build up where we're asking students the kinds of things that they like to eat for breakfast and why they like to eat them, right? And how it's making their bodies healthy or not. So we're learning things about family practices. We actually had students volunteer recipes, favorite recipes from their homes. And we created a summer camp cookbook. And then some of those items students bring in that become part of a panel of ingredients that students can use to create a buffet that then is going to be part of an experiment where they're feeding mosquito larvae tetramin as a control, and then some mixture that their team creates amongst other kinds of ingredients. And then this, over the course of weeks, they're observing the development of the larvae. They're how many are living, how many are dying, what's the nature of the water quality. They're recording these in our science journals, right? And this is the stuff they're sharing out every morning, and we're asking them, right, to explain their thinking. At the end, I'll explain that some of these sample lessons are available on the website, and I am inviting people to reach out and connect with me around the broader curriculum too. So, okay, so go to the next slide. So maybe we'll skip this for the moment. Let's put a pin in this if there's time at the end, I was going to show you what a whole lesson sort of looks like, but I think you might be getting the drift. So let's keep on going. So let's watch this video. This gives a good sense of the kids. And I'm hoping we'll get some audio.
I was excited, and I never wanted to go to sleep and all that because I was gonna come to Mosquitoes and Me.
Mosquito and Me is fun because we got to do a lot of stuff that include mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes and Me isn't just for fun. It's actually for to learn science and all that stuff.
Other kids should come to camp because it gives you an opportunity to learn a lot of things. It gives you a good setup for your future depending on what you want to be and what you want to do.
And it's really awesome to get to know things that you have never learned before. And there are nice tree scientists that will teach you all about that.
People that are like science, this is for you. This is for you.
I think other kids should come to camp because it's fun and you learn about mosquitoes and science.
I mean, it's amazing. You get to learn more.
It's like learning, but it's more fun than like school learning.
And some kids are thinking, ew, mosquitoes are gross. But once you actually learn about them and try something new, you'll change your mind about it and say, hey, this is actually kind of interesting.
First field trip that I went was to a park, and we had those science tools like a spoon, and we have to dip it inside of a mosquito little river to catch one.
We found some mosquitoes, we found some larvae, we found some pupas, probably some eggs.
So they're finding mosquito evidence here in places that they may never have thought of looking.
I got so many.
Let me see.
They're all, most
Holy
of them at the bottom.
Cow. Great job.
I'm a fan when we get to this.
Okay, I can't wait.
My favorite parts of camp are when we go swimming and when we do like the hands-on activities.
And you actually get to feed them and watch them grow.
Oh, the people are just like so fun. It helped me not have such a boring summer.
The best part is that two schools come together and we all get to know each other and we get to learn together, and that is what I call a great place. Yeah.
So what is really beautiful and interesting about this camp is the way that it's grown out of the work of the people we've involved in it, including the young people themselves.
But I think this is a really, really unique program.
They get to just be. And there's a blend of science and a little bit of art and a little bit of music, all in the spirit of community. That I think is just really special. That is really cool.
This isn't what any ordinary science group. It's a good science group.
So we'll just keep, because I've got my whole comic book to talk about, so I'm keeping my eye on the clock. So of course we had insights from evaluation. We had surveys where we were asking youth about changes in science skills, science attitudes, science knowledge. We also asked them and their families about the conversations that they were having at home. We were talking to the pre-service teachers about their confidence in science teaching, about their commitment to equity, right? Again, I talked about family conversations, right? And family interest in the science education of their children. So that's just really broad overview of the way we approached evaluation. Next slide. Maybe I'll save this for the end. This is something I'm working on that I'm calling synergistic science learning, but you see that I've noted here this conceptualization of learning as mutualization of movement. And of course, not just physical movement, but sort of movement from knowledge, skills, dispositions. but it's happening in bidirectionally in this case between the pre-service teachers and the young people. I think I'll leave that for now. Folks can ask me about it later if we've got time. So here's some things, right? Youth demonstrated greater gains in science skills during subsequent years of the program. This is sort of related to the second point about the most powerful gains were evidenced in youth who were multiple time repeat. So we had many students that came back 3 or 4 times, and those gains were statistically significant. So this idea of cumulative sort of exposure. I love this idea. Our evaluator noticed that repeat youth participants were actually observed to be using the ambitious science teaching strategies in their interactions with new participants. So even though we never made those explicit to them, they were picking up through the modeling that approach, to working with other youth, And, this last one maybe is not a surprise. We observed greater gains in reported science skills than in reported science attitudes. And I think this has to do potentially with this word science, that students sort of have these persistent and resistant conceptions about what science is and feel uncomfortable identifying themselves maybe as scientists. So something to think about. Next slide. Okay, great. I think I'm right on track. So after about 2.5 years, maybe 3 years of doing the summer camp, I wrote an administrative supplement that got funded. That created our Mosquitoes and Me, it is a Mosquitoes and Me science comic, but it's called Mosquitoes Suck. It's driven by our overarching question of, people versus mosquito. You can see that it's place-based in Des Moines, and responsive, as you'll see, to the youth who were in our camp, because in our science comic book club, they helped us think about some elements, particularly representations of the youth characters, and the plot in the science comic book, aligns with overlays, represents our curriculum. Okay, next slide. Okay, so maybe, science comics do really interesting things. I think we'll skip past these. It's going to take a, right? Okay, so here we go. So, this was right before the pandemic, which affected the way that it was going to roll out, but we gathered on Saturdays for 5 hours. There were 9 youth and 3 pre-service teacher participants, and it was really a chance for them to authentically apply their summer camp learning, and think about how to engage other youth, their families in science communication through this process of creating a science comic. Of course, what we created isn't a replication of what we did in our science comic book club, because we had to fast track the comic book to production, but we did get some insights from our group that are reflected in the comic book. Okay, next slide. Gathering 1, we reviewed, graphic novels, asked students what makes a good comic book character. You can see some of the, again, carrying on the discursive, sort of paying attention to student idea thinking. Next slide. Gathering 2, what did we do in camp? What do we know about mosquitoes, and how might we include mosquito science in a comic story? And we started getting them thinking that way. Okay, next slide. Gathering 3, what are our individual science comic stories? So students started to create their own science comics, and pre-service teachers would give them feedback, to sort of keep that moving forward. Next slide. Okay, more of this. What would our character look like? And this is really important. This is where most closely the youth in participation in the comic book club is represented in the comic book, is that students then made drawings of themselves that our graphic artist then took and sort of enhanced. Okay, and they also came up with public health slogans. This is a page of our comic book, but it's also a poster. So in addition to the comic book, for you all who are interested, I have this size posters of mosquitoes, and also theater-sized posters of mosquitoes and this public health poster. So I'm happy to send those out. We just need to sort of work out some details. Next slide. Okay, so this is just, you're getting a sense of how rich this was. Keep going. I want to make sure that there's time for questions. right? So here's one that this student particularly was able to sort of develop. Keep going. And, you know, we wanted to do other things. We wanted to read and act them out. We wanted to create audio skits or podcasts. And we were going to deliver a community celebration event and a book launch with a signing. And all of that got disrupted due to the pandemic. But here's some examples, right, of you can get a sense of what we did in camp and then how it shows up in a comic book page. Right, Mosquito. You also see like that is a page from the science journal there on the table, the going through changes. Okay, next slide. Right, blood feeding. You can see Lyric there. You can imagine how much students loved seeing Lyric blood feed, right? But that's in our comic book too. The student leaning over with the beads, that's Tiara, who's featured as a character in our book. Yeah, next slide. Right, we went larval dipping and right, we have image of doing this, right, field work, right, in the comic. Next slide. Right, and more mosquito habitat discovery, right, also reflected in the comic book. Next slide. Science journals, you're getting the sense, right? I'm really proud of the comic book because it does so closely align with what we did. But this does both give you a sense of the comic book and also a sense of some work that students did in the science journal. Right, and we do have themes of science and society in the comic book, which were very much part of the conversations that we had in camp. I think I'm getting towards the end here. So I love these quotes from students. I think these are worth, right? These are worth just taking in, right? Right. We may not think that art and science go together, but we can make a comic book that appeals to the general public and still have it be educational, right? It's not like, oh, boring science stuff. And if we had been able to, and I hope you will play the video when we send it around, you'll hear the kids say, you know, we got to work with really good scientists, you know, like the idea that maybe there are some scientists that aren't so good, you know, but that, you know, because of, I think, the community building we did, right. We were relatable. So I think right, Lyric as the right, real scientist, right. She really, I think, overturned their notion of what a scientist is in ways that were really powerful. Next slide. Right. This is, so the comic book will teach people things that they need to know, right? And then this idea of like the connection to society, you know, so because mosquitoes are a problem, but people don't focus on it, right? So we're helping people understand what we're thinking and help us join together and like fix our problem, right? Like that's what we wanted, the students thinking that way. I think we're almost done. Next slide here. Right. So I think what we did, right, the urban ecosystem, our Mosquitoes in Me summer camp, I think it's a model of how to engage everyone, right? Not just underrepresented youth, but I think we were particularly successful in engaging youth. And because of that, actually developed this framework that will make science work better for everybody more broadly. Right. And it really shows how mosquitoes can be leveraged as teaching tools, even if you aren't necessarily about just doing mosquito outreach, but mosquitoes themselves can just invite folks in to doing science, right? And we created these resources to share that I'm not going to have time to share today, but I really want people to reach out if they want to engage with me further around the resources. I'm happy to do that. Oh, there we go. So that's the end. That gives us about 10 minutes. I don't know, Cassie, if depending on how many questions there are, I wonder if I were to play like the video on my end, I might have to find it. Or even, anyway, I might be able to get some audio on my end, but let's see if there's some questions first.
Sure. And if anybody has a question, please put it into the chat so that Katie can see it and respond.
Yeah. I've just answered my thorough PowerPoint answered all of everybody's questions.
Well, Laura has a question. She has her hand up. I'm just wondering, Laura, if it's all right if you would type it into the chat. And Dorian has a question. Do you have plans on ways to amplify this work?
Yeah. Well, right now we have a grant under review to NIH, same funding mechanism that would build on the co-learning idea and do basically kind of the summer camp co-learning work, but with mosquito control professionals, right? What are they? I'm blanking, right? The mosquito assessment, right? The mosquito assessment district folks, the MAD, right? The mosquito abatement district folks. They would be key participants along with community college students who then would be working together in a co-learning way so that the mosquito abatement professionals are getting insights into sort of, right, the tri-sci pedagogy and how to do their outreach work in potentially different ways, and the community college students are getting turned on to entomology and to abatement as a potential career opportunity. And part of that is then students would get selected in as interns in mosquito abatement districts. So moving it out, right, to the mosquito abatement district folks, so that beyond, because the audience we were working with, right, were young students really around like trying to fuel a science identity. And this work would be much more around trying to make mosquito outreach more effective and culturally responsive. So that's what we've got right now. I love these floating hands. I've never seen them float before. Oh, and yeah, I love the little confettis. Anything else?
Well, it was an excellent presentation. I learned an awful lot about your program, and I've had a chance to just kind of look at it on the surface, but getting a deeper dive into it was really very valuable. So thank you.
Yeah. So maybe there can be a follow-up where maybe the links to the video goes out and an invitation for folks to reach out to me if they're interested in getting access to the full curriculum, the science journals. Right.
Yep. And all of our Mission Mosquito webinars are posted on the Globe Mission Mosquito webpage. And so if you, after this recording is uploaded, I'll put the links into the description for people.
Oh, great. Yeah. Because the science comics in particular, right? They're doing me no good sitting in my office. So they're meant to be used for science programming, these complimentary copies. So really would encourage people to reach out.
Great.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for facilitating the invitation. This was a joy to just revisit my work and plug into the work that you all are doing.
Well, thanks.
Well, I gotta say, Katie, it was really one of the most fascinating talks we've had in quite a long time. And I think there are a lot of pedagogic elements that are going to be very interesting to our target audience here. There's a lot of educators here working with very interesting demographics, and there's a lot to learn here and a lot to unpack. And I know I'll be watching your talk again for sure, because it was really exciting. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart. And I hope to see you again, maybe in this webinar another time.
Yes, that sounds great. And I'll fondly remember the carousel of happiness. So it's a metaphor for how we all should be waking up every morning, striving to ride the carousel of happiness. So for those that joined the webinar late, they wonder what on earth we're talking about. We'll just let it be a mystery.
That's right. Okay. Thanks, Katie.
Okay. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. I would like to just pass on the links to the Mission Mosquito Larva Hunters Guide that Liz talked about last week. And the Facilitator's Guide is available for viewing also. And those are both in Google Docs. One's in a Google Doc, one's in a Google slide deck. So please take a look at those there. And I was at a meeting yesterday, and the IVSS is looking for volunteer judges. So it's not too early to be thinking about the commitment and your student projects. Judging is going to take place mid-March to April of 2023. And the volunteer time is about a 2-week commitment. And you could review 2 to 3 projects. For those of you who might teach college students or have some graduating high school seniors that you feel comfortable extending the invitation, they are also welcome to apply to be a volunteer judge. So please keep that in mind. Please check out the link. It's in the globe.gov news events, or if you search the Globe page for IVSS 2023 volunteer, they will be hosting a training webinar in the not too distant future to give you an idea of what's involved if you have not judged in the past. And I'll put that link in the chat here. And I'm super excited to, by this time next month, Dr. Loeb will be back stateside, and we're going to learn about citizen science in Brazil through her experiential learning and teaching. Please register for that webinar at this URL. So we'd be happy to have you join us next month at this time too. If there are...
Yeah, I was just going to say that for you mosquito folks, you know, when I was here in Brazil, it was the dry season. And so I don't have a lot to report about mosquitoes. However, I did work with schools and communities using the land cover tool and the tree tool. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. And then we can also have a nice discussion about how these tools can be very important also if you're doing mosquito research. So I hope you'll enjoy a little bit of a travelogue next month.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us this month, and I appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you in November. So take care, everyone.